Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
And welcome to another episode of Tales from the Fandom. Today I am joined by one of my favorite Twitch streamers that I have had the pleasure and fortune of getting to hang out with him for several months. And I am proud to have Bryan, aka ProUnproGaming, joining me today on the podcast. How are you doing today, Bryan?
I'm doing great, Dave. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It is an absolute pleasure. And I have to say, this is the first time that we are talking together at the same time versus you being on stream and chatting and me chatting in the text, or me being on stream and you chatting in the text, or both of us being in a separate streamer's chat and just chatting back and forth.
Yeah, this is the first time there's not been one of us communicating via keyboard for a change. So
it's crazy. We're bridging the gap of Twitch delay.
Yes. Technology is a magical, wonderful thing.
It is, and I always say I said when I recorded with Cardia, whose episode came out on July 8th, is that I just happened to stumble upon your stream because I had found our mutual friend Jazz Elves and was watching him play, but then he raided your channel at one point, and that was it. And I was like, well, dang, now I got another person to follow.
Oh, you're gonna make me blush.
It's just, you find people and good people lead you to more good people. So I'm happy to have you, join me on the podcast, because it's something that I've wanted to do is for a long time, is to reach out to people that were streaming. And I think it took a while to get there, but I'm glad that I've had a few people join me that, primarily are that Twitch streamer person rather than like other podcasters or cosplayers or authors, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. And I just have to say that, I think it's a wonderful thing that you came to me via Jazz Elves, because I will always shout to the heavens, and whoever will listen to Jazz Elves is one of my absolute favorite people in the world, streaming or otherwise. So, for him to endorse me the way that he has is, very humbling for me. Even though, the truth be told, and we'll get into this a bit more later when we get into the streaming discussion, but, Jazz Elves and I, our friendship goes back years before Twitch existed. So,
ooh, I'm excited to hear this story. But I will digress. We'll start off with one of the fandoms that you and I both share a passion of. And I think you're more into it present day, although I kind of stick around on the periphery of just reading what's going on thanks to like websites that keep me updated. But we're both into professional wrestling.
And how? Very much so.
So I guess the first thing I want to ask is, when and how did you get into pro wrestling?
Well, I want to say I was 5 years old, and to put that in context, I'm now 34. When I was 5 years old, I remember, in fact, I feel like, granted this dates me a bit, but I feel like I honestly got into it more from, of all things, the action figures. Because I remember my mother one day when I came home from kindergarten, gave me a World Wrestling Federation action figure. Obviously, the World Wrestling Federation, now known as World Wrestling Entertainment, or WWE. And it was Hulk Hogan. And I was just like, holy crap, this dude's awesome. Like, and then like from there, like the funny thing is a lot of these guys that I got figures for, I got figures of them before I saw one match of theirs, which is hilarious to me. Like, she got me figures for guys like, for Hulk Hogan, I think I had the $1 Million Man Ted DiBiase, I had Andre the Giant, I had the Ultimate Warrior, I had the Big Boss Man. And by the way, quick side note, rest in peace, Ultimate Warrior, Ray Traylor, a.k.a. the Big Boss Man, Andre the Giant. But very sad that we've lost all of those guys, even if I have some personal issues with the Ultimate Warrior's philosophies on things, but I won't get into that. But yeah, and from there, I remember renting, there was Acclaim actually put out an NES game called WWF WrestleMania.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say that came out around like 88, 89, somewhere around that time. Maybe even a little bit before that. And, well, by modern standards, that game is not good. In fact, I'm sure there were people back then that would tell you back then it wasn't very good. But it was, for whatever reason, like the music was really well, and actually the music was really good in that. And interesting fact about the WrestleMania game, WWF WrestleMania on the NES, while it was published by Acclaim, was actually developed by a studio that, if any of your audience out there, has been following video games for the last, 2-3 decades, will probably know this name. It was actually developed by Rareware. And if you're not familiar with Rareware, they were responsible for the Donkey Kong Country series, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye, Perfect Dark. Basically, any major N64 platformer or multiplayer shooter was their doing.
Okay.
And they became a very, very big name in console gaming throughout the 90s and the early 2000s. But anyway, I digress. But then I got into that, and then then I started getting into watching wrestling regularly. It was actually around the time of I believe the first episode of this aired back in 1993. I think it was January 93 was when a little television program called Monday Night Raw debuted on the USA Network. I'm sure you remember that show very, very well.
I do, because I was thinking back to when I got into professional wrestling, and it was at some point, because we had just moved to Canada, so I lived like 3 hours north of Toronto, and I have no clue how I got into it, but I remember whenever I'd get sick, my mom would rent me wrestling videotapes, like the old WWF Coliseum tapes.
Oh, the Coliseum video series. Oh man, you're taking me back with that.
Yeah, so that's how I got into it. I remember watching it. I remember begging my parents in 1990, because my favorite pay-per-view was Survivor Series. And the thing that I loved about Survivor Series is that back then they only had 4 pay-per-views. So you had these grudge matches that would finally like culminate, and they'd have these great like teams for elimination teams. And Ted DiBiase's like, I've got a mystery person, and he's going to come in and take out like all of you, because it's like the Hart Foundation and Coco Beware and like Hacksaw Jim Duggan. I can't remember the team lineup, but
that sounds right.
I begged my parents. I said, please let me rent this. I will pay out of like my birthday money to get this. And that was during the time where you had to go to the cable place, get that special box to order it, and then bring it to your house. And that was the debut of The Undertaker. That
Yep.
was my first pay-per-view. And from there, it was like a regular thing all through probably college and beyond. I watched up until about, 2007-ish. And then I started not watching it as much.
Yeah, and two things I could say on that. One, 2007 to 2008 is the time when a lot of avid wrestling fans would say the product kind of starts to go downhill a little bit. And on the topic of Survivor Series, yeah, it's weird to think back that there was a time when there were only 4 pay-per-views, and the 4 pay-per-views, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but because nowadays they still refer to those pay-per-views as the Big 4. But the 4 were Survivor Series, the Royal Rumble, SummerSlam, and WrestleMania were the 4 big ones.
That is correct. And Royal Rumble, before it got newfangled, it was you just won it. It wasn't for a title shot. It was just you got to win the Royal Rumble. Like that was an honor in and of itself.
Yep, because when it first debuted, in fact, I remember correctly, the original Royal Rumble wasn't even a pay-per-view. It was a televised NBC show, I believe, if I remember correctly.
I believe the first Royal Rumble was more of a it was televised, and then they decided to bring that to the pay-per-view and then officially have like the first Royal Rumble. But yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Hacksaw Jim Duggan win the first Royal Rumble?
I believe that is the case. Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if it was him or Big John Studd, because I remember he won one also. One of the early ones. By the way, I have to back away from the mic before I do this, but every time I think back to the Survivor Series at which the Undertaker debuted, I start laughing because I hear Roddy Piper, may he also rest in peace, in my head, because there's one line. There's this one line of commentary he has that has stuck with me for my entire life. And I'm going to back up from the mic, and you're laughing because you know what I'm going to say. But I have to back away from the mic because because he's Roddy Piper. He yelled everything. But I believe his exact reaction to The Undertaker went a little something like this. Ahem. Look at the size of that ham hock.
Oh man, but you know, I think back on it now, and I've always had these conversations with another friend of mine who grew up during the same time, but he grew up during like NWA and like that type of wrestling because he grew up in the South,
the territory era, basically.
Right, and so I came up through WWE, he came up through NWA, but we always talk about like how we miss good color commentators like Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse Ventura, Roddy Piper, Macho Man. You know, you always had like these really strong color commentators, and Bobby the Brain Heenan, of course. And,
yeah, I was about to say Bobby Heenan was a fantastic commentator.
Yeah, it is wild just to. I mean, I've watched some of the product recently, but it's not some. I mean, I think it's passed me by at times, and other times I'm like, okay, there's still gems there, but not as much.
Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. And you know, but going back to like, you know, when I came up through it, like I kind of had a couple different you know, my wrestling fandom has had the occasional lapse, I would say, where I kind of dialed back my viewership of it a bit. I ended up kind of, you know, going back to you know, what it was like for me growing up. You know, I remember when the Monday Night Wars kicked off, because I remember when I first started watching World Championship Wrestling, which, funny enough, you mentioned your friend was really grew up in the National Wrestling Alliance. Well, WCW was kind of born out of the National Wrestling Alliance, and my early viewership of WCW, you know, was where I fell in love with guys like Sting and Big Van Vader. And I'm going to stop saying rest in peace to everybody who died, because then I'm just going to get sad. But yeah, WCW had a lot of really good times. And actually, funny thing about the, you know, to tie it back to the Undertaker conversation, but I only found this out in the last like 4 or 5 years or so. But I thought the entirety of the Undertaker's wrestling career had been within World Wrestling Entertainment, and that's not true. He actually had a short stint in World Championship Wrestling as Mean Mark Callis. And I did not know that. In fact, fun fact was that the man that people would come to know as Paul Heyman was his manager in World Championship Wrestling, known back then as Paul E. Dangerously. But yeah, it's like, it's so funny to go back and watch like what he could do. And like even like I remember seeing this video where he, you know, he's put in what, you know, what they would call a squash match, where he's against some guy. I don't even remember the dude's name, but like, I remember watching him and, you know, watching him land this drop kick. And I don't think anyone in modern wrestling can get as high as that man got for that drop kick. That was one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. And I'm just like, I don't know if he left WCW or if they decided they had nothing for him. But if the latter was the case, I can't imagine what they were thinking there. But and I think it honestly speaks to the talent of him that I don't think there's many wrestlers that could have been given the gimmick of the Undertaker and made it actually be intimidating and scary and not stupid. Because I feel, you know, I've always believed that when it comes to that there's a fine line between horror and comedy. You know, you lean too hard in any direction, you end up with something that's funny and not actually intimidating or scary like it's intended to be. But I'm not going to lie to you, like The Undertaker, that dude, when I was a kid, scared the hell out of me. Like, I actually remember having WWF, going back to the video game thing again, I had WWF Super WrestleMania for the Super Nintendo. And anytime I picked The Undertaker, I would mash the start button because I didn't want to hear his damn theme song, because the Super Nintendo rendition of the Death March was scary. It was like, bong, bong. And it's just like, no, I don't want to hear it. No, stop. But yeah, man, like, and then I remember, like, you know, growing up, like, I didn't actually get to see my first live wrestling event until I want to say like 97 or 98. Because that was around the time the internet existed, and then I could actually find out when wrestling events were happening. Because for whatever reason, I never thought to ask my folks, "Hey, is there one coming, and could we go?" I just thought, "Wow, we're Virginia. We probably don't really get anything cool like that." Although, funny enough, I remember the first pay-per-view I ever heard of happening in Virginia. Although I found out later there had been several before that, I just didn't realize it. The first one that I can remember hearing about was the first iteration of WCW's answer to the Royal Rumble, which was World War III.
Mm-hmm.
Their first ever World War III event was actually at the Norfolk Scope in Virginia, and I had meant to ask if I could go, but I forgot to, and then because I was a kid and easily distracted, and just never got around to it. But I also found out, granted, I would have been like 3 when they happened, but I also found out that WCW, when I was like, in the mid to late 80s, rather, the mid to late 80s, they held a couple of their big Starcade events in Norfolk.
Mm-hmm.
And, Starcade was like WCW's WrestleMania, basically.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
my only regret about my age is that I was not quite old enough to enjoy those events when they happened. But, what are you going to do?
Exactly. Like I remember the one that was closest to us when I was a kid was WrestleMania 6 in the Toronto Sky Dome.
Oh,
and,
yes.
And we live 3 hours north of Toronto, and we happened to be driving to New York State on the day that it was happening. And I'm like, well, there's the Sky Dome, and I know WrestleMania is going to happen there, but I'm just driving by. But then
man.
we lived in Panama City during the Monday Night Wars, and they always used to come. WCW used to come for spring break at Club La Vila.
Yeah, I remember that.
So went to those 2 years in a row, and then they had a pay-per-view out in Dothan, Alabama, I believe, and we drove out in '97 to watch that, and that was it. But it was really cool to see, like, not just see, but like for the Monday night stuff and in Panama City, like a lot of them like to party it up when they were there for spring break, and there were some that just they couldn't have a match, they couldn't do stuff because they had been day drinking.
They partied a little too hard.
Oh yeah. But when you were coming up, or even I guess before we start talking about like the modern stuff, like who were your guys that you just loved?
Let's see. In the era of that was around the time they would call it the new generation of WWE, from like 90, from when Hogan left in like 93 up until about 96, 97. They called that the new generation of World Wrestling Federation. That was when I spent most of my time watching it as a kid. And my favorites, I two come to mind for me, and they were the two of the biggest stars of that era. The one being the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels, who is definitely one of the best ever. But funny enough, like when I was a kid, obviously a lot of kids my age were into like the real hard hitting, big guys like like The Undertaker. Don't get me wrong, I've always loved The Undertaker too, but like even at a younger age, like I had a real appreciation for the technical side of wrestling. The chain and catch as catch can style of wrestling, and I absolutely fell in love with Bret the Hitman Hart. And just the things he could do in that ring, like people often say, like, when you talk about technical wrestlers like him, they're the kind of guys that would just tie their opponent up in knots, and he almost literally did it. Like it was pretty amazing to watch him work, and his brother Owen was just as good as he was. Like Owen was phenomenal too. But yeah, those guys were my favorite. Going on the World Championship Wrestling side of things, again, I've always been a big fan of Sting. I was a big fan of his work. It's funny, Sting and Bret Hart had the exact same finishing move, so go figure that I fell in love with both those guys. But yeah, I was a big fan of those guys. I always loved Hogan. I always loved Hulk Hogan, and of course, given the era I grew up in, I had to love the Macho Man. Oh yeah, and yeah, and Randy Savage was one of my favorites. Like, although funny enough, like by the time I was really actively watching, he was kind of more in the commentary and Slim Jim commercial role than he was an active competitor. But yeah, that dude was just so much fun. I could listen to that. I could have listened to that dude talk forever. Like he sounded hype about everything, and it was just wonderful. But yeah, Hogan, Savage, Bret, Shawn, yeah, Flair. Like from what little things I saw of Flair at my age, I enjoyed him then. And yeah, I already mentioned Sting, so I think that pretty much covers it. Those were my favorites.
I liked when I was getting into it, I really liked, WWF tag teams. So Hart Foundation, British Bulldogs, Demolition, and then branching out to like some of the single wrestlers, like Jake the Snake. I love Jake the Snake. Uh, self admitting this, I really dug Brutus the Barber Beefcake.
Hey, that's fair. You're
Just coming with those big old hedge clippers, and he's like, yeah,
exactly.
And then when WCW started, because I didn't get into WCW until right before the Monday Night War started, but all the luchadors, I loved that they focused on luchadors. I loved Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Dean Malenko, Chris Jericho, like all those 220-ish pound wrestlers that you knew could go, and they sometimes they'd let them go and just have these incredible matches, but then wouldn't give them the time of day later on. And it's like they're going to do something, and they finally did get their chance to do it, albeit on a different stage. But
I kind of had mentally limited myself to like the 93, 96 era when I was talking about my guys, but you just listed off a whole bunch of some of my favorites from like the 97 to like 2001, 2002 era. Like, I think that was really what kept me tuned into Monday Nitro and Thunder for so many years during that time with WCW was, needless to say, like, the World Wrestling Federation had the kind of product they were pushing. Whereas it felt like even then, World Championship Wrestling had a bigger focus on the in-ring product than the World Wrestling Federation did, which is admittedly still kind of true, but we'll get to that soon enough. But like you said, Eddie, like Guerrero, Malenko, Jericho. I know his name is a little taboo these days, but Chris Benoit was a fantastic technical wrestler. That being said, his ability does not take away the things he did, and that's all I'll say on that topic. But, and then and WCW introduced me, like you said, the luchadors. And if it weren't for WCW, I would never really know much about guys like Rey Mysterio Jr., Billy Kidman, Psychosis, Juventud Guerrera, Blitzkrieg, La Parka, all these guys that, I don't know who was in charge of the booking in WCW at that point, but somebody there recognized that there was merit in these Lucha Libre style wrestlers, because somebody there was either watching AAA or CMLL at the time, I'm guessing, because that's how you would know about guys like those. And, and it's just like, I even remember, I didn't find out about this till much later, but I remember, my good friend, you may have seen him in my chat a couple times. My friend Jerry, he introduced me to a match that I think was actually, believe it or not, one of the opening matches of World War III, the first one in Norfolk, because they actually brought in I think it was a women's tag, and it was featuring 4 women from Japan. And I remember one among them was this big woman named Aja Kong.
Yes.
And there was also, I think one of the other women in that match was, I think her name was they called her the Danger Queen. I think it was like Akira Hokuto. I may be completely botching that name, and I apologize if I did, to any wrestling fans that are listening to this. But I remember her, like, they were just like phenomenal. And again, like, WWF was not showing us that kind of content back then. And to a certain extent, like, I feel like they didn't really take women's wrestling seriously until much, much later.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, those were the kind of things that made me stay watching WCW for many years during that time. And now that we're kind of getting into the Attitude Era time of things, I mentioned how I felt like Virginia, the state of Virginia doesn't have may not always have the biggest moments for wrestling as far as like the World Wrestling Federation or World Championship Wrestling are concerned, unless you count those Starrcade events. But there was one event that there was one thing that happened in, I think it was like 97, or actually maybe it was later than that, but it's looked back. It's like, it's one of those things that anytime WWE puts out any type of video package regarding the Monday Night Wars, they inevitably air a clip from this, which is you may recall, there was a night at one point during the Attitude Era where Raw is War was being taped at the Hampton Coliseum.
Yep.
But literally on the exact same night, across town in Norfolk, WCW was taping Monday Nitro. And WWF decided, we're going to, take advantage of this and have a big PR stunt. So they had, D-Generation X, that big stable they had back in the Attitude Era, Triple H, X-Pac, the Outlaws, and they had them roll up in a big old tank right up to the freaking Norfolk scope and like Triple H had a big like megaphone, and he was trying to call out WCW as he called them, and like a bunch of fans had signs and were having all this stuff, and like the WCW staff like shuts the big gate in front of them so that the DX guys can't get into where they're trying to set up Nitro.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just this big, massive PR stunt, and it was just so funny. But I didn't realize then how important that was in the landscape of wrestling, because they still talk about that. So
yeah, that is one of the craziest things that happened. Because I remember watching that live, and it was crazy. And I remember, I don't know if it was on a podcast or if it was like one of those videos that WWE puts out now, where they talk to like Eric Bischoff, or they talk to some of the wrestlers during that time period for like the Monday Night Wars. And some of the wrestlers were like, yeah, we were on the other side and we wanted to go out, but they wouldn't let us.
It's like, no. You don't talk to the people from the other company.
Yeah. How dare you? How dare you, sir?
Yes. I will also say, speaking of favorite wrestlers, is from that era, two more guys came out of World Championship Wrestling that I became massive fans of. And, a lot of modern day fans don't look back on one of them very kindly. But growing up, I thought Bill Goldberg was a monster. Like that dude was so much fun to watch. And it's like, like he wasn't as technically sound as, a guy like Bret Hart or, any of the guys we talked about earlier, like the Guerreros or the Malenkos. But like, man, like, but I say when he wanted to put the hurt on people, he did, and it was really amazing to watch. Like, I remember me and a good friend of mine in high school. Actually, it would have been middle school then. We weren't high schoolers yet. That was like 8th grade. I remember us staying up the night Goldberg beat Hollywood Hogan for the title. And I remember us like hugging and being so hyped that Goldberg won the belt off Hogan, because, back like Hogan was ultra mega heel at that time. And, he was the leader of the New World Order, and everybody wanted somebody to take that damn belt off of him. And Goldberg, beat him in front of like however many thousands of people there were at the Georgia Dome that night. And that is one of the loudest crowds I've ever heard. So.
Yeah, that was crazy. I know, let's see here. Goldberg was after... geez, I can't remember. Goldberg was after like the Sting Hogan match, I believe.
Yes.
Because I remember I was working at Golden Corral my senior year. So I was with a whole bunch of other wrestling fans, and we bought Starrcade that year for the Sting Hogan match and went crazy for that, and like ridiculously crazy. And then I remember like, Hogan's got the belt again. It's like, oh gosh, can we please like do something? Because I always remember like the first 2 hours of Nitro, loved it. Like great tag team matches, great luchador stuff, TV title, US title, whatever they're doing. And then that last hour was just so like, okay, yeah, we got Sting, we got Luger, we've got Giant, Hall, Nash. It's going to be some combination. It's like let's get going here.
It's like Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Get on with it,
we had that Raw is War. We had the Monday Night Wars, and then eventually WCW got sold. And I know, like I watched. Let's see here. I watched up until about 2007-ish, and then took a break. But I came back when. Probably like a year of right around, oh gosh, I can't remember, because I got super back into it when Daniel Bryan was making his like year-long run for the title.
Yep.
And that's when I like got reinvested in it to the point where I was watching it like on YouTube or on clips or on the internet whenever I could catch it. But did you take a similar break when you were watching wrestling, where you're like, I know, especially for like a lot of people after the WCW stuff, there was a dip of, okay, we've seen some of those dream matches and now we're in that lull. A lot of some of the other people retired and were out for a little bit.
Yep. Believe it or not, that actually wasn't when I took the break. Looking back on it, and one other thing I do want to touch on real quick before I forget to, regarding the sale of World Championship Wrestling, is some people say, a lot of people will say that the bad ratings and the bad storylines led to WCW's death. There's a little more to it than that, because the thing that truly killed World Championship Wrestling was the AOL Time Warner merger.
Yep.
Because, World Championship Wrestling at the end of the day was Ted Turner's baby. Like, Ted Turner had a passion for wrestling, and that was why it had been such a, mainstay product on the TBS Superstation and TNT, was because he loved it and he wanted it to be a big thing for them. And for many years it was. But the time came when they did the AOL Time Warner merger, where the AOL Time Warner board was like, we don't want anything to do with wrestling anymore.
Yep.
Now that you're off the board, we do not want this anymore. And because Eric Bischoff actually tried to put together enough capital to buy World Championship Wrestling. But basically what happened was, even if he could have bought it, AOL Time Warner said, even if you could, we're not putting this on our television stations anymore. So they effectively canceled Nitro and Thunder.
Yep.
And basically, without a television deal, WCW meant nothing. And really that's the reality of modern wrestling. Is there's a lot of independent promotions out there, but unless you have a television deal, you're still minor leagues at best.
Exactly. And even with a television deal, if you're not on that major, or even not even major, but like a second tier channel where you're hopeful to get maybe half the audience, like you're nothing, because there's been a couple of them where it's like, oh, you're on what channel is it? Do I have that channel? Like, you get into that question of, I don't even know where to find this.
Exactly. Yeah. And I can touch on that a bit more in a moment, but kind of moving into when I took the break. So I was still watching very actively up until around 2009. And because in 2009, my local friend Dave and I, who were both very passionate wrestling fans, had our first opportunity to go to WrestleMania. We went to WrestleMania 25, which was in Houston, Texas. And we attended. We actually went the whole 9 yards. We actually bought one of the travel packages that WWE provided.
Oh my gosh!
You pay like X amount of money per person, and they'll be like, here's a ticket to like the breakfast buffet we'll do the morning of Mania. Here's a ticket to the Hall of Fame ceremony. Here's tickets to 2 sessions of WrestleMania Access, which is kind of their like fan festival thing. And here's like a lower level WrestleMania seat. And granted, it wasn't like on the floor, but it was the seats we had were really good for that Mania. And now, and also we went to like a local wrestling convention thing and got to meet some of our favorites, from the WCW era. Like, I got to meet Diamond Dallas Page. I got to meet Booker T. He was another favorite of mine from that era. I got to meet Samoa Joe. I got to meet, granted, they were no longer married by that point, but I met Diamond Dallas Page's wife, Kimberly. She was still gorgeous, by the way. And that was all really cool. So, very cool moments there. That was also kind of one of my first tastes of Ring of Honor, which, back then they were like a big up and coming independent promotion. And now they actually have a television deal. But yeah, we went to WrestleMania, and granted, a lot of that event isn't looked back on super fondly in the grand scheme of WrestleMania, but we watched, which is still arguably one of the best matches I've ever seen live, which was Shawn Michaels versus The Undertaker. And that match is utterly phenomenal. And like, I will never forget, retroactive spoiler alert, by the way, the moment when Shawn Michaels kicks out of the Tombstone Piledriver, which to that point, I think might have happened once or twice ever. Like, my friend Dave looked like he had seen a ghost. Because my friend Dave is still the biggest Undertaker fan I know. And when that happened, I wish I had taken a picture of his face. Because like if you ever go back and watch clips of that, and the camera actually zooms in on the Undertaker's face after Shawn kicks out, and the Undertaker just has this look on his face like, you've got to be effing kidding me. and it's funny, like the look, his face is pretty much identical to what my friend Dave's face looked like. But yeah, after that, we went home from WrestleMania. We had a great time that night. I could probably tell you a whole podcast worth of stories about our trip to Houston, Texas, and WrestleMania. But I remember getting home and like, you know, it's I kind of had that feeling for like a few months or a year or so, where I was just kind of like, I feel like I've seen the best it's ever going to be. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like I saw the pinnacle, like that, like not even just Mania, not even just WrestleMania as a whole, but that match alone, the Undertaker Shawn Michaels match. I'm like, what else could they possibly offer me after that? So I think by that point I was like, you know what? It wasn't even that I was burned out. I think it was more than anything that I was just satisfied. Like I was just like, you know, wrestling gave me that moment, and I will never forget that. I don't really need to follow it so closely for a bit. And then I don't even think it was a conscious decision. I think it was just something that naturally my attention went elsewhere, you know?
Exactly. Like when I stopped, it was more of like is the time when I moved back from Japan and I was getting married, and I didn't have time for 5 hours at that time of wrestling when I've got work and family time and adult time and all that stuff, and my wife doesn't like wrestling, so I don't have it on. I'll catch up on the internet, and that's totally cool with me. But what brought me back was, I remember, like, I don't know, is reading about Daniel Bryan's initial, like, coming back, because I remember he had gotten fired and then he came back and then he was champion, but then he lost, and is a culmination between him and like AJ Lee and Dolph Ziggler back when he was the champion, and it's
Yep.
like that's kind of that time period of me getting back into it,
Mm-hmm.
and then just following it that way up until when Daniel had to retire, and then mostly now it's me on the internet looking at like Bleacher Report and seeing what's going on, or watching Total Divas or Total Bellas at times, or catching bits and pieces that are on Hulu,
Mm-hmm.
and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, and that's totally okay, and that's totally cool. And funny enough, while I kind of found myself gravitating away from World Wrestling Entertainment around that time, that was around the time, that period there from like 2007 to 2009, when I lived in Northern Virginia from around, the summer of 07 till about the fall of 2010. And that was around the time when I was finally getting to see, I mentioned Ring of Honor, and Ring of Honor started doing some shows at this gymnasium in Chantilly, Virginia. Actually, no, I'm sorry, not Chantilly. It was Manassas, Virginia. There was this big, like, this big family-owned gym that they would run shows at, and I actually remember. I have a great story to share with this, because it's another chance for me to share a story about my mother. I remember Ring of Honor had their first ever Virginia show at that gym, but like 2 or 3 weeks before it happened, I broke my foot. And I couldn't really get around much. And mom was, chilling. Mom came up and hung out with me and helped me take care of things and stuff, and helped me get to work and stuff, because she was cool like that. And I remember the weekend of the Ring of Honor show came around, and I'm like, hey, Mom. She's like, yeah. I'm like, I hate to ask this, and if you don't feel up to it, don't worry about it, but there's a wrestling show about 30 minutes west of here that I really wanted to go see. Would you be okay taking me to it? And she was like, yeah, we'll go. And God bless her, she took me, wheelchair and all. Yes, I actually had a wheelchair, because admittedly my upper body couldn't really handle, crutches for very long at any given time, because
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't lifting, bro, at the time. And we went there, and the Ring of Honor staff were so cool. They're like, hey, yeah, we'll wheel you up to the corner here. They kind of wheeled me to a little side opening so that I could see everything and didn't have to stand up or anything. And yeah, they made a real good impression on me there. So, and I share this story because, and by the way, my mom was blown away by how athletic the guys in that promotion were. She had never seen anybody wrestle that way. But because they wrestle way harder and way stiffer than, WWE or WCW guys did.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember the champion of the world champion in Ring of Honor at that time was a guy that anybody, if there's any active listeners here who still watch WWE, this is a gentleman who is a commentator for the NXT brand, and also I think he's exclusively a commentator on the NXT brand, their world champion was a gentleman by the name of Nigel McGuinness,
Mm-hmm.
who's now a commentator for WWE, and everybody hated that man. Like he was supreme stuck up British heel. Like it was amazing. And because this is not a televised PG rated brand, the fans are a little less censored as for what they can chant at the wrestlers. And the fans started chanting, "F you, Nigel!" Only they weren't saying F, if you know what I mean.
Right.
I'm keeping that censored because I'm pretty sure you're a family man, and I'm sure you would appreciate me not cursing all over your podcast. But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And like I just have my head, my face buried, and I'm face palming super hard, and I just hear my mom go, "Bryan, are they?" And I'm just like, "Yeah, yeah, they are. They are absolutely saying what you think they're saying, mother." And it was just like there was part of it that's like, all right, well, that's enough wrestling for one night. But no, we stayed and watched the whole thing. It was cool. But I love telling that story because it's just like, Bryan, are they saying yes, mother? They are. But yeah, by the way, and this is a side note, I'm just because I'm curious, I didn't know you had ever lived in Japan. Was that like from a military time or something?
No, I graduated college, and after graduating college, I decided I wanted to go teach English in Japan. And in the way that it works is for conversation schools, they hire anybody from the States, at least, that has a 4-year bachelor's degree. It doesn't matter what your degree is in, as long as you have a degree, they provide the visa for you to get over there, and yeah, you go from there.
Wow, I did not know that was a thing. I mean, it makes sense, but
Yeah.
I'm actually surprised to hear that it's like, as long as you have a bachelor's degree and you can speak English, please come over here and teach us English.
Yep. I mean, I think it's changed now. Not the process, but like the big school that I worked for had a number of issues at like just like with pay or with contracts and all sorts of stuff. So they actually folded a couple of years after I came back.
Oh,
But
I see.
I know that the like there are still conversation schools, and that's what you're generally hired for is conversation schools. And the thing that I did was after my first year, I found a company within the city that I was living in, and I worked at a middle school for a year as as an assistant teacher, basically. So I was there for the kids to talk to and converse with and do like projects with, but I was there with like different 6th, 7th, and 8th grade Japanese English teachers.
Oh, cool. That's really awesome.
And I regret not ever going to see any wrestling there because where I was, they had I think it was Ultimo Dragon's promotion back when he was running it was there because they used to have stuff somewhere, but I never got to go to it because again, navigating a foreign country where you don't speak or don't read, and it's like just trying to figure out how to get to do some cool things sometimes is out of my reach.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you there. Although, I think this is actually a really excellent segue into my talk on Japanese pro wrestling. Because, growing up, the only exposure that I really had to think promotions like All Japan Pro Wrestling and New Japan Pro Wrestling were when Mike Tenay would name drop them when in referring to the body of work of one of the Japanese wrestlers on Nitro or Thunder.
Yep.
And because Mike Tenay, that was the thing I loved about listening to the Professor Mike Tenay's commentary was they called him the Professor for a reason, which is that he knew about everyone. And anytime there was somebody that was new to a WCW broadcast, like as they're walking to the ring, he would sit there and list all their accomplishments in like All Japan and New Japan and all this other stuff. And it's like, Mike Tenay would be like, you may not know this guy yet, but you will, and you will love him. And it's like, okay, you got my attention, Mike. And up to that point, and then, when it comes to New Japan stuff, their content wasn't really easy to come by when we were growing up in America because there weren't any channels in America airing New Japan Pro Wrestling.
Yep.
In fact, a lot of people probably didn't even know they existed. But like I mentioned my friend Jerry, who is one of my very best friends, and I actually met him when I moved back to the part of Virginia I'm originally from in 2010. I met him in one of my D&D role-playing groups. And I remember us talking, and they were like, and one of them at the table was like, "Oh yeah, Bryan, you'll get along really well with Jerry. He's a wrestling fan too." I remember the first question Jerry ever asked me. He said, "So Bryan, what promotion do you watch? Or what promotions do you watch?" And I said, "Well, Jerry, let me tell you." And this is back when they were, oh yeah, I told him, when I want entertainment, I watch WWE. When I want wrestling, I watch Ring of Honor. When I want to be reminded of why WCW went out of business, I watch TNA. And Jerry laughed and said, "You know what? I think you and I are going to get along I think we're going to get along just fine." And he and I have been friends for 9 years now since then. And he has always, gone out of his way anytime there was a good New Japan match, whether it was a recent one or an older one, to sit me down and watch it with him. And so thanks to him and all the content he had access to, that was when I learned about, Vader's body of work in Japanese pro wrestling. Because
yes,
as big as Vader was in WCW, he was 10 times bigger in Japan.
Yep.
Like, he was a big deal in Japan. And thanks to Jerry, I learned about guys like Stan Hansen and Antonio Inoki and who else? Yuji Nagata, Masahiro Chono. And there's going to be people I know that are listening to this are going, "Who the heck are you talking about?" And all the Japanese women I talked about, like Hokuto and Aja Kong and all those guys and all those women who were so amazing at what they did. Go ahead. I sound like you had a point there. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, speaking of Japanese wrestling, I remember getting into it because, and I swear I don't remember how. And I was probably Googling stuff back, or not even before Google, but there used to be tape traders, because that's how you got your Japanese stuff. Is people would bring tapes back from Japan and compile them and sell them. And so I remember buying Super J Cup and Super J Cup 94, Super J Cup 95, where it's Benoit's wrestling, Eddie Guerrero's wrestling, Jericho Malenko are wrestling. And you're seeing them before they even got to ECW. You're seeing all these death matches that they're doing, the women's wrestling at the time, where they're pulling out commas or they've got thumbtacks, and you're like, what is going on? And yeah, that's what I just had to say is I remember having those tapes, and it was it mind blowing then.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, Jerry, one of the first things Jerry told me about in regards to Japanese wrestling were the tape trading forums that you mentioned. And we were actually just talking about that the other day. And yeah, it was just all these guys, Dr. Death Steve Williams had a short run in the World Wrestling Federation in around 95, 96. But his body of work in Japan is immaculate. It's just so good. So good.
It is crazy. And I know before we switch off of wrestling, I know there's been developments now where we're finally having, I don't know, because I don't watch WWE. I know what's going on because I read the recaps of what happened, and I shake my head a lot of the time.
Yeah, me too.
But AEW was announced as this thing, and you're okay, they're going to go the Ring of Honor route or whatever. Jeff Jarrett's Global Force Wrestling, where it nothing really ever happened. Ring of Honor, of course, has progressed beyond where it was, but you thinking nothing of it, and then to have I think it's Shad Khan, who owns the Jaguars down here, is their backer, and you're okay, well, he's got a lot of money. And then Jericho and Omega and the Young Bucks, and it's you're getting a lot of this talent that has never signed with WWE or is transitioning away from as in Jericho. You never thought Jericho would not come back to WWE, but after his stint over in Japan, he's I'm going to this company, and what they've done so far is nothing short of incredible at this point.
It really is. They were one of those companies that I'm given the folks backing it, like you said, the Young Bucks, Kenny Omega, Cody, and Cody and his wife Brandy, you know, I was like, you know, these guys are onto something, because, you know, I remember when Jerry and I actually drove to Chicago last year for the first event they had ever held. It wasn't considered All Elite Wrestling at the time. That was a purely independent thing that they ran. They basically put together a super show called All In. And it was actually at the Sears Center in Chicago. And back then, they actually had Ring of Honor's backing. Ring of Honor was actually providing the streaming for that event.
Right.
And, you know, they brought in guys from, you know, they actually, like, for example, the Ring of Honor world title was defended at that event by Jay Lethal, and the NWA world title was defended at that event. And they actually brought in Kazuchika Okada from New Japan Pro Wrestling to wrestle there. And that was the first time I'd ever seen him live in person. And that was an amazing experience to see him. And like the energy, like even then I noticed, I could tell that something was changing, you know, like when I went to that event there, like, you know, when I went to like WWE house shows or SmackDown tapings in Virginia, the crowd was kind of dead. Nobody was really all that hype about it. You know, it's whatever. There was a completely different energy at that show. Everybody was, you know, there was no chance of boring or same old S or whatever else. Everybody was just invested and into it, and like they were dedicated to giving us a really solid wrestling product. And they even said when they came out at the end of the show, they said, you know, we don't want this to be a one-stop thing. We want to do this again. And then when they got Tony Khan's backing, you know, because it's actually Tony Khan, the son of the guy who runs the Jaguars, who's really the main backer of All Elite Wrestling.
Okay.
And yeah, and they're like, we're going to do our first show in May called Double or Nothing. And I'm just like, oh God, please be good. Please be good. Please be good. Because, you know, it's like you never get a second chance to make a good first impression, as they say. And it was a 4-hour show, and we were glued to the TV the entire time. Like you know, in the past, like we've gotten to the point now where we try to watch WrestleMania. I can't get through all of WrestleMania anymore, because that's a freaking 7-hour show now if you count the pre-show. And it's like by the end I'm just like I'm done. I'm not entertained by this. But that I was glued to the TV for that entire 4 hours, and they are onto something very, very special with that promotion. And I know it's funny, you know, how full circle wrestling has come. When we talked about, you know, the days of World Championship Wrestling and their time on TBS and TNT. And guess who has the television deal for All Elite Wrestling? And it's TNT.
Mm-hmm.
How full circle wrestling has come. And one other thing I also wanted to add there is we talked about Japanese wrestling. My friend Jerry and I also had the chance back in April to attend an event at Madison Square Garden called the G1 Supercard. And that was actually a cross-promotional event between Ring of Honor and New Japan Pro Wrestling. And I got to say, it's like I could watch those New Japan guys wrestle forever, because they are all so good. Like, because you have guys like I already mentioned, Kazuchika Okada, Hiroshi Tanahashi, Zack Sabre Jr., Tetsuya Naito, Kota Ibushi. Like, I could just go on for another 3 podcasts about New Japan Pro Wrestling, but I won't do that. But yeah, like New Japan, actually, they just announced last night, because Jerry and I watched the opening. Considering you've spouted off names like the Super J Cup and stuff like that, then you know what the G1 Climax tournament is.
Yep.
And they kicked that off last night in Dallas at the American Airlines Center. And the wrestling there, again, just immaculately good wrestling. And they actually announced that they're doing New Japan is doing an East Coast tour the last weekend of September, with a show in Boston, New York City, and Philadelphia. And Jerry and I have already begun preliminary plans to attend one of those shows at least. So, because
that's awesome,
because New Japan is just something that can't be missed. So really, like, we're in a very interesting time with wrestling, where, you know, the thing about that stretch from like 2001 till recently is, for all intents and purposes, WWE was kind of the only ball game in town. Yeah, you had little up and comers trying to make something like TNA and Ring of Honor, but they really never got kind of out of the minor leagues to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they didn't have the clout and the backing of a World Wrestling Entertainment. But now you've got All Elite New Japan coming in, and suddenly the wrestling landscape looks a lot different now. And it's actually a really exciting time to be into wrestling again.
Yeah, and like with formerly known as Dean Ambrose, John Moxley, like there's money to be made if you leave WWE now. It's not where you're just trying to string together enough jobs to put money on the table. and doing all these independents, like you can actually go and make money doing something completely different and actually being able to do what you want to do.
Oh, definitely. And actually, it's funny you bring that up because, Cody, with Cody, the Young Bucks, and Omega, especially Cody and the Young Bucks, like, that was kind of their whole thing. Like, Cody left WWE because he was like, I think I can do better for myself than this company is doing for me.
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, like the indies were falling all over themselves to get him to come to their promotion. And he had stints in Ring of Honor and Impact and, all these other big independent promotions. And just like Cody made his name incredibly valuable. And like the Young Bucks the Young Bucks and Omega had just so much notoriety after that. And then when they all went together and went to New Japan, like that was the moment I think that New Japan really started to get a foothold in America because they got the attention of guys like those. And, all that happened because guys like Cody, the Young Bucks were like, woke up one day and said, you know what? We don't need WWE. We can go touring around the country to any promotion that'll have us. And not only do they pay the bills, but they're affluent at this point, and, it's, sorry, I know I'm rambling a bit on the,
well, it's
topic,
okay.
But yeah, it's just, it's so exciting, how much wrestling has changed. And, it makes me very hopeful for the future of professional wrestling as a medium.
Exactly, me too. And I'm really excited to see, especially with AEW. I'm excited to see where they go. New Japan, I'm excited that they're finally. I mean, they've had like the foothold a little bit on the West Coast, but it makes me happy to hear potential East Coast tours, in the future.
Indeed. So, but yeah, so lot of cool things happening in wrestling right now, and I for one am just happy to be a part of the ride for that.
Exactly. So getting away from wrestling is another of our big shared fandoms is video games.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you and I are relatively close in age. You told me your age, and everyone now on the podcast knows how old you are. And I'm about, let's see here, 6 years, almost 6 years older. So I got a little bit of time on you. But what was your first system that you had?
Well, it's not the first system that I owned, but I remember the first system I ever played. I don't know if it was my sister's or my cousin's, but I remember the first console I ever played was the Atari 2600.
Okay.
And I remember a couple of games in particular that I played on there. I remember my sister had the Atari 2600, or whoever owned the console had the Atari 2600 version of Pac-Man. Which, granted, looking back on it, it's not a great version of Pac-Man, but the mere concept of being able to play Pac-Man at home was revolutionary at that time.
Yes.
Back then, the only way you got to play that was to go drop a few quarters at the bowling alley, or the arcade. And, I remember that game. I remember Pong, of course. I remember Combat, the tank game. I can remember playing Haunted House and not having any idea what to do. All I knew was I was a big pair of eyeballs wandering halls and not knowing what to do in that game. And there was one game that, funny enough, I only remembered what it was thanks to a YouTube series that I followed called Classic Game Room, where they did a review of a game called Egomania. Now, when I say Egomania, I don't mean waffles. I mean, like, basically the best way I can describe it is there was an Activision game that was kind of in the same vein, and that game was called Kaboom. And the concept of Kaboom was there's some criminal up on top of a skyscraper who's wandering around the top of the stage dropping bombs, and your job is to run around and catch him. And basically the idea was you kept going until you eventually missed one, and that was your high score. And I played a game that was very similar to that, and it was called Egomania, where there was this chicken that would keep dropping these little green eggs, and if you missed, and the more eggs you missed, it filled up like the pile of egg at the bottom of the stage, and if it filled up too much, that was when you got game over. But I had a lot of good memories of that game. But I remember, like, as much as I enjoyed the Atari 2600, when I was born in '84. And by the time I was 4 years old, maybe 5, I'm not sure exactly how old I was, but by then I was well aware that the Nintendo existed. And I don't remember I think the first time I played one was when my cousins had it. And I remember playing like Super Mario Brothers and Mike Tyson's Punch Out and all this stuff. And I'm just like, I need this. I need this in my life. And I remember, and you know what? I think my parents knew, because I swear to God, I may be completely misremembering this, but I seem to recall, like, when we were at my grandparents one night, I remember going to my dad because my birthday was coming up, and I was like, "Hey, actually, maybe it might not have even been my birthday. I think it was." And I remember going, "Hey, Dad, is there any way we could get a Nintendo?" And he was like, "Yeah, I think we can do that, bud." And when I got home, there was already one there. So I think they knew. I think they knew, even if I didn't realize they knew. But man, like it's so funny, like, when I look back on that time, because like I was so madly in love with the Nintendo. Like I even though I could never finish it as a kid, I played the heck out of Mike Tyson's Punch Out, Super Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt. I remember playing Super Mario Brothers with my sister. I remember playing, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I remember just all these, granted, TMNT is not looked on as highly these days, but I had some good times with it. But I remember another great story I get to share about my mother. I remember after I finished Super Mario Brothers, I wanted to get Super Mario Brothers 2. And I talked to I was like, "Hey, Mom, now that can I get that?" And she was like, "Hold on." And she called up the toy store. I think it was like, it wasn't even like Toys R Us. I think it was like Children's Palace, which is long out of business since then. But I remember her calling. And I should point out, this was a year or two out. This was at least a couple years after Mario 2 came out. But she calls up the toy store, and she was like, "Hi, do you guys have Super Mario Brothers 3? And you got to keep in mind, 7-8-year-old Bryan somehow didn't know Super Mario Brothers 3 existed." And I was like, no, I wanted Mario 2. But for whatever reason, I don't remember why, but my mom was like, no, we're going to get you Mario 3. And I'm like, "Oh, I'm okay, whatever." And then we went to the toy store, and then we got Super Mario Brothers 3. And that started a love affair that is still going strong today, because as great as Super Mario Brothers is, Super Mario Brothers 3 is a timeless game.
It is. Man, fond memories. That's all I have to say. I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. When we lived in Canada at the time, so didn't really know much about what was going on. My friend had a Nintendo, so I'd go over and play it with him. But he's like a really rich, snooty friend, so sometimes he'd get annoyed at people, and he wouldn't let people over and be like, "No, you can't play my Nintendo," or whatever.
Oh yeah.
And I remember asking for it, and I probably had a Nintendo Power subscription before I had a Nintendo. But we were going to get it, but in Canada, the Nintendo was $600. So when we would regularly drive to New York, because my dad was in the military at the time, so we were stationed in Canada. But we drive to the New York Air Force Base with an empty minivan and go grocery shopping for like 2 months in one day. So we'd go to the commissary on the base and just buy 2 months worth of stuff. And I remember going to the Toys R Us down there, and it was like $300. It's like, and that's when I got it. We brought it back, and my world was changed. Like Punch Out, Mike Tyson's Punch Out, Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt, Track and Field, all like TNC Surf, the surf skateboard.
Oh my God, I didn't think anyone else played that game.
Oh, I love that game.
Oh, my cousins had TNC Town and Country Surf Design,
yes.
And we played the hell out of it together. Sorry, I said hell. My bad. I said it again.
It's okay. It's okay. But yeah, and then Nintendo Power, so you get like the maps and the tips and the tricks, and also like that is like the thing of just having the Nintendo and just going wild. Like that was it. I remember having like the special case for all my games so I could take them over to other people's house, and all good. all good stuff.
Are you sure you didn't live my childhood? Because this sounds really similar to me. Because like I think I got it at a garage sale. It was like a black faux leather like case.
Yes,
It looked like almost like a
yes.
tackle box or a lunch box. It was like this big black rectangular case, and it had like a little like a clip fastener on
A
the
little gold clip or something.
Yep, and then you clip it open. It was like a suitcase for NES games, and
Yes.
you could like have them in like a row in the case, and it was just like, yeah, I carried that freaking thing everywhere, man. Like, oh
yeah.
man, yeah, like, and then like I can remember, like, it's funny. I remember definitely being a big fan of Nintendo Power because I actually can remember a time like during the early days of the Super Nintendo era. Because for 1 year, I remember, and I'm sure you're going to remember this. For a year, Nintendo Power had two recurring comic books, and those two they had basically a comic book series. One was based around Super Mario World, and then they had one based around the events of The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past.
Mm-hmm.
And I absolutely fell in love with the Link to the Past comic because it was just so well drawn and the characters looked so cool, and it just further cemented my love of that game because I still hold A Link to the Past as one of my all-time favorite Zelda games. I absolutely adore that game. But yeah, like I can just like maybe I'm skipping a bit too far ahead to get into the Super Nintendo side of things, but like yeah, Nintendo Power was my jam, and I can remember. And being a Nintendo Power subscriber, you'll remember this too. They had a 1-800 number you could call for free and ask them any like Nintendo question you wanted. And I probably put in like 100 hours calling that number. And I even remember the number. It was 1-800-255-3700 was the 1-800 number for Nintendo of America. And anytime like I found out about like a game that I wanted or was curious if a game had been delayed, I would call and ask about it. So they probably had like a warning up in their boards at their office. Like it's like if this phone number calls you, just humor the kid. It's fine. It's just like, oh man, like so many good times there. And and the funny thing is like with getting into like the Super Nintendo and stuff. I can even remember it wasn't until like I was in middle school where because my Super Nintendo fandom had been focused on stuff like The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past, Super Mario World, Super Punch-Out, which is another great game by the way, and all these other and Super Metroid. Oh God, Super Metroid's so good. But then like the friends that I made in like 6th grade and 7th grade were like talking about we're talking about this game called Chrono Trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what now? Because like, and at that age, like I really wasn't into role-playing games yet. Like I would see them in the magazines, and like it was like to young Bryan, I'm just seeing these screenshots that are just big pictures of big loads of text and numbers, and I'm just like, I don't understand anything that's going on right now, and I just want to go stomp on mushrooms, as Mario. So I'm good with that. So I didn't get it, and like, but then I can remember, I through them I discovered Chrono Trigger. I also, thanks to those friends, is when I discovered PC gaming as well. Because they were really into Age of Empires, the Microsoft strategy game. You may recall that one.
Yep.
And that was another genre I wasn't really big on until that time. So it's kind of interesting, as you grow, when because I can remember when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and one of my aunts, not meaning anything nasty by it, but would say, "So Bryan, when do you think you're going to grow out of that Nintendo stuff?" And here we are, and I'm 34 years old, and I still haven't.
Yep. Nintendo, Super Nintendo, a few of my favorite games from that was like Pilot Wings, which shockingly my kids were playing Super Smash Brothers on the Switch recently, and one of my sons was like, "Oh, I'd really love to play Pilot Wings. It looks so cool." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'd really love for you to play Pilot Wings too, but the updated Pilot Wings I heard wasn't good, but I have fond memories of like Super Nintendo Pilot Wings." And then of course Final Fantasy II was like the game that just tugged at my heartstrings, and story and plot and all sorts of stuff, and started my spiral into role-playing games there.
Yep. And wasn't Final Fantasy II technically Final Fantasy IV?
Yep, Final Fantasy 4 in Japan, Final Fantasy 2 US. Yep,
That's what I thought. Because
just like
similarly, Final Fantasy 3 in America
it's
is
6.
6 for them. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, and then PC gaming and getting into that, and Sega and PlayStation and Xbox, and now here we are with Microsoft, PlayStation, Sony, and Nintendo, and Microsoft, and PC.
Yep. Yep. Unfortunately, from a hardware perspective, at least Sega is no longer with us, but they are still alive in software, thankfully.
Yes.
Funny thing about me and Sega. My exposure to Sega was mostly for many years through my cousins, because I had a cousin who their family had a bit more money than mine did. So not that we were doing poorly, mind you, but he just had a lot more game systems than I did. He had the Genesis. He was also like the one dude I knew who owned a Sega CD. I didn't know anyone else who owned one of those things, because I remember that thing being like $400 or $500 when that came out. I gotta say, thank God my parents never bought that thing, because there really weren't that many good games for that thing in retrospect. There was Sonic CD. There was crap.
I can tell you the one game that my friend had with the CD was you were flying through sewers shooting like rats and stuff.
Sewer Shark.
Yep,
that was the pack-in Sega CD game, I think. And I remember trying that one out. I think I played it for all of 10 minutes. Was like, okay, I'm bored. The thing that was really sad for me was, I remember when I was that age, and granted, I still like them, don't get me wrong, but when I was that age, I was a massive Power Rangers fan. And I would consume anything Power Rangers I could get my hands on.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember years later, seeing there was a Power Rangers game for the Sega CD. And it was, without question, the most lazy, poor excuse for a video game I've ever seen. Imagine, if you would, do you remember an arcade game called Dragon's Lair?
Yes.
So the premise of that being, you have this really well animated cartoon that reacts to your ability to choose prompts on the screen, and if you mess it up, you get to see, Dirk the Daring die in, various hilarious ways.
Yep.
Basically, imagine somebody took maybe 2 to 3 episodes of the Power Rangers, took the fight scenes, overlaid DDR style arrow commands on top of it, and the goal was to match those up, but the action on screen was not in any way affected by whether or not you hit the buttons in time. Like, the Megazord got jacked up whether you hit the buttons correctly or not, because that's how the episode went. So it was just like, I remember going back and seeing the footage of that many years later and going, holy crap, I'm so glad my parents didn't buy this for me, because I would have been angry as a kid playing this. Like, wow, this sucks. It's just like the Sega CD, really tried to kind of, make its money off of look at the fancy video graphics we have. I mean, yeah,
Yep.
The games aren't great, but look at these graphics. Like the Sega, I mean, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo can't do that. And it's like, well, yeah, but they also have games. So there's that. But I remember my cousins had a Master System too, which was basically like the Game Gear eventually became the portable Master System, because they were very similar in terms of power. But I actually remember being one of the few people I knew growing up to have a Saturn, the Sega Saturn.
Okay.
And, as a kid, I didn't really know about the better games. Like, I would find out later in life, I'm like, oh man, I wish I'd gotten those games. Those were the good games for the Saturn. Like, I got into the Saturn for the Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 port and the platformers and Virtua Fighter 2 and stuff like that. But the Saturn in America, a lot of the really good games now, because I do kind of do some retro game collection on the side. I'm not super invested in it, but I'll go to my local shops, once a month or so, and if they have anything that stands out, I have to text my wife and be like, hey, they have game, it's X money, can I buy? Because some of those can get kind of expensive nowadays. I know one thing you may or may not have seen me stream recently was a Dreamcast game called Illbleed.
Yep.
A horror game. And luckily, one of my subscribers was generous enough to, through a friend of his, hook me up with a reproduction copy of that game, because one of my local shops had an original copy of Illbleed with the manual and all, but they wanted $150 for it.
The only game that I ever purchased more than retail price for was Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 for the Nintendo 64 from Japan, and you had to have the converter that came with it so that way you could play it. And then you had to go on what the internet was back then, so that way you could translate the names of each of the wrestlers to who they actually were, so you could know who you were choosing.
And also translate the menu so you could actually get into the game and not just sit at the options menu forever.
Yep.
Oh man. Oh, but while we're on that topic for a second, if we could, man, as a video game fan and a wrestling fan, has there ever been a better game console than the Nintendo 64?
No, because and I will say this, because the N64, between like the WCW and NWO games and then the WWF like No Mercy and WrestleMania, those were perfection. I don't like the arcade style games that they did with like the PlayStation and Future. And then the only fond wrestling game I have besides those N64 games was the arcade version of the wrestling where you chose a tag team to go up against Demolition.
Oh, it was WrestleFest, I believe it was.
Yes. And then the only other one was where, like in Nintendo, where you had like Starman and all those crazy wrestling people that would like bite faces and stuff.
Yep, that game was literally just called Pro Wrestling.
Yep.
Fun fact about that game, actually, about Pro Wrestling on the NES. The director of that game, this will put into perspective why that game was as good as it was. The director of that, I think it was either the director or the executive producer of Pro Wrestling on the NES, would eventually go on to be the director or executive producer for a little franchise called Fire Pro Wrestling.
Okay.
So suddenly it starts to make sense. Like, oh, this guy just understands what a wrestling game is supposed to be. So, but yeah, like the N64, like you already listed them off. WrestleMania 2000. It started with WCW versus the NWO World Tour, and it went into WCW NWO Revenge. It went to WrestleMania 2000 to No Mercy. Fun little fact I also learned early in the last few years. Apparently, there was going to be a follow-up to No Mercy, and it was going to be called Backlash, similar to the pay-per-view that they had called Backlash.
Right.
But I think it ended up getting canceled because they were moving to the GameCube at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But God, those games, like the closest any other wrestling game has gotten to those since would be either the Fire Pro series, which is a great wrestling series, although that's a little different because Fire Pro Wrestling is done in a 2D kind of animated environment versus a 3D polygon environment.
Right.
But those games are great too. But the closest I've ever had to those games, to the N64 experience outside of the N64, was there was the SmackDown series on the PS1 and PS2, which those were generally pretty good games. But I think it was 2003 when they put out SmackDown Here Comes the Pain, which is easily the best that series has ever been, and it hasn't gotten quite to that level since, in my opinion. But I had friends in college that would play that with me who didn't even care about wrestling anymore. They would still play that with me. We had a lot of good times with that one.
So beyond wrestling games, like what kind of video games draw your attention now for you to play?
Well, I can safely say that like there are very few games that I won't play. Like at the very least, give a chance to. But I've always been huge on platforming games like Mario, Sonic, Crash Bandicoot, Banjo-Kazooie on the N64 is a great one. Conker's Bad Fur Day. Just really, like, the N64 was a heyday for platforming games, and that and just I had so many good times with those games. But yeah, those are big for me. While I have a hard time finishing them because I get easily distracted by other games, I love role-playing games. Final Fantasy VII was a formative game for me as a middle schooler. It was actually one of the really, like, and actually I can segue into this with my talk on with talking about the PS1. The PS1 was, kind of really, I really feel like the PS1 molded the type of gamer that I became as an adult, because I can recall the first 3 games that I ever owned for my PlayStation 1. and they are three. They would go on to become three of my favorite franchises. The first three games I had on my PS1: Crash Bandicoot 2, Final Fantasy 7, and Resident Evil 2. And you know me, we've only known each other for a few months, but in that short a time, I think it goes to say how deep my love of the Resident Evil franchise goes.
Yep.
Like it's so funny that before Resident Evil 2, I didn't want anything to do with horror. Like when my cousins wanted to watch Friday the 13th, I left the room. I didn't want any part of that. Like I wasn't big on scary movies or any of that nonsense. I didn't want to watch The Shining, Nightmare on Elm Street, none of that crap. But then I played Resident Evil 2 because I saw this really crazy like live action commercial they had done. I remember watching it, like I think it was like a commercial like during, I can remember where I was the first time I saw it. It was a commercial during reruns of that old variety show In Living Color that FX used to air. And I remember they had that the live action commercial for RE2, and it would end with like the chief going, "Everyone's gonna die." And for whatever reason, like I'm just watching it, I'm just like, that looks insane. I have to play that. And then I got my parents to let me rent it, and they're like, "Are you sure this looks kind of scary?" I'm like, "It'll be fine. How bad could it be?" I'm not gonna lie. I had a couple nights where suddenly the creaks in the house sounded like zombies. Not gonna lie. I'm not too proud to admit that. But yeah, RE2, despite, its archaic tank style control scheme, I adapted to that control scheme and just, I fell in love with the series because while yes, it was scary, it was unlike any other game that was out at the time because, every other game that I played growing up, like let's take, for example, Contra or something like that. A lot of the shooters we grew up with on the NES and Super NES and Genesis for that matter, could be really described as it's spray and pray. It's like it's like you have infinite ammo. Who cares? Just shoot. There's going to be like 8,000 enemies on screen. But then I get to Resident Evil 2, and the game is like, here's 15 bullets. You need to make that last for like the next like 30 minutes until you'll find 10 more. And it became a matter of trying to, you had to pick and choose which enemies you shot at and killed. And sometimes it made more sense to, shoot the zombie 3 times, make it fall to the floor, and then run around it. But the thing that made that also challenging was the thing about that franchise is, there's this concept of inventory management where, okay, not only is ammo limited, but you're a human being. You can't, this isn't Diablo 2. You can't hold 45,000 things. You can hold whatever your pockets can hold. And it's basically like you have like 6 to 8 slots depending on which character you choose. And it's like, okay, you can hold your pistol, your knife, and your bullets. Okay, you only have 5 slots left. You better make sure you know what you're doing. You're going to want a health item. You're going to want an herb or a first aid spray. And you need that jewel to fit in the, and you need the red jewel to fit in the statue to get the key to the police station because that was a good idea to somebody at the police station. I don't know why. But in fact, there's a whole story there that I didn't even know growing up when I first played RE2, is that the canon in RE2 says the Raccoon City Police Department used to be an art museum. And it was converted into the police station, which is why there's like paintings and creepy art all over the place. And it's like, okay, that explains why it's so grand and, kind of archaic looking in its architecture, which architecture that I think made it look really interesting. But yeah, RE2 was a formative game, not just because I fell in love with that franchise and horror games in general, but horror as a medium. Because like after that, in high school and college, that's when I started getting into like the George Romero Night of the Living Dead series, like Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and getting into, some of the other horror movies. And like, I had a fascination in college. I don't even know if with a lot of these films, I really watched them all the way through, but I started to develop this fascination in college. And this is a tangent, I'll admit, but I'll keep it short, is I developed a fascination with the work of this Italian horror director named Lucio Fulci, who had this kind of knockoff zombie film that was just called Zombie. And he was doing some really interesting stuff at the time because his like gore effects were like unlike anything anyone else was doing, and they were really scary with how realistic they were. And as weird as it might sound, I was kind of into that for a bit. Like I thought that was really cool that they were achieving effects like that, so I got really into it. And so yeah, I really feel like Resident Evil, especially RE2, would go on to mold not just my gaming preferences, but my preferences for media in general.
Oh, totally. I mean, it's amazing where you get into the habits of, okay, these games here are the basis for every game that I'll play. Where, like, for PC gaming, I somehow got into like Wing Commander
Classic.
and X-Wing and TIE Fighter. And so like I'm in those space like not shooters, but I don't know, space flying games or whatever.
Space combat simulator is a good way to put it, I think.
There you go. And the other, like the flip side, is like Civilization. So between those are my PC games, and then like the original XCOM and like Terror from the Deep, and that's pretty much it. So those, I'll stray as long as it's in the same genre. Or if I can, like now with the advent of like Twitch and YouTube, I can see people playing the game before I spend the money and decide that game may not be for me.
Exactly. And I think that'll be a good segue into the streaming conversation. But before we get to that, I did have one or two other little stories I wanted to share, if you don't mind, just real quick.
I don't mind at all.
So we were talking about, formative games. And, I talked about Resident Evil and Final Fantasy. I actually had a funny story to share regards to Final Fantasy VII. That game kind of had, was kind of a very social game for me and two very close friends of mine named Justin and Daniel. We would all get together like every weekend, and our playthrough of Final Fantasy VII was basically a joint effort. I was the one with the PlayStation who had access to the game, so we would all take turns, playing through sections of the story, and we were just glued to the TV during all these different, sections of the game. So in many ways, I almost feel like I probably have technically only played like a third of Final Fantasy VII, but I experienced it all with very good friends. And, there were so many good experiences there. But I told you that to tell you a story that you're going to be like, oh my God, how did you stay friends with this guy? Jokingly, of course. But I remember I shared my first period Earth Science class in 7th grade with my friend Justin, and we always sat together. And I remember coming in to class one Monday morning. And I will never forget that morning because I remember the first thing my friend Justin said to me. He said, "Hey, Bryan, did you hear character dies?" And I was like, I'm not even through the first disc. So I won't go into detail. And I know some people are going to be like, oh, dude, that game's 20 years old. Most people probably know who I'm talking about. But needless to say, he spoiled like the biggest character death in that game for me.
Mm-hmm.
And when he realized I didn't know that, he's like, "Oh, crap." And I'm just like, yeah. Yep. But I didn't get upset with him. I knew he was excited. I knew he didn't, he thought I'd gotten farther in the game than I had. So it didn't lessen the impact of that moment too much for me, but it was still, I just tell that story because it's so funny, because Final Fantasy fans will hear that story and go, oh, like, oh my God, how did you not murder him in cold blood right then? It's like, it's just a thing, it happens. But, another formative game, and honestly, I've probably in my time on this earth have never gotten past the first 20 minutes of it. But I remember, you mentioned Civilization, which which I, funny enough, only recently started to really enjoy, because growing up, I didn't really, that kind of thing wasn't my thing. Mm-hmm. But I remember for the PC getting a game called Baldur's Gate 2. And, Baldur's Gate, the Baldur's Gate franchise is a series of role-playing games that is based on, I think, 3rd edition D&D rules, maybe even 3.5. And I thought that scenario was really cool. And I think that eventually is what led to me getting into Dungeons and Dragons from a tabletop standpoint, even if I didn't necessarily make it that far in Baldur's Gate ever, which I need to go fix because I have that on Steam. Mm-hmm. But another story that I think is worth sharing as far as games go, if I can remember the story. Oh yeah, on the topic of Civilization. So my wife and I have had a chance. She's been to one show with me, and I had gone to, I think, one show before her, and then we went to one together. But Tommy Tallarico, who was a guy who worked on a lot of game soundtracks during the Super Nintendo Genesis era, started up a concert brand called Video Games Live.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, he does these big orchestral tours around the country, playing music from a number of different video games. And I can remember, I don't remember if it was at the first show I went to or the second. I want to say it was the first. But while I wasn't big on Civilization at the time, I at least understood how important that series was.
Right.
Like anytime somebody brings up strategy, somebody inevitably will mention Civilization, because Sid Meier's Civilization is, one of the most important strategy franchises that's ever existed. And I didn't realize this when I went to the show, because this was when I lived up in Northern Virginia, but they did a show at the Wolf Trap Center in Vienna, Virginia, which is this really awesome outdoor 100% wood, basically like orchestra hall outdoors. It's almost like an amphitheater basically, and it was so cool. And they did a show there, and at the end of every show, they'll actually have tables set up outside where you can meet, the composers and get autographs and stuff like that, and meet Tommy and all them.
Mm-hmm.
And Sid Meier was there, because they actually the orchestra played the title theme for Civilization 4 at that event, at that concert. And Sid Meier was there, and I got to meet him. And even having never played the franchise, I still understood how important he was to PC gaming. So when I first walked up to him, I did the thing a lot of wrestling fans do, where they'll put their hands up and bow like I'm not worthy.
Yep. And
I remember him laughing at me, going, "Oh man, you ain't got to do that. Come on." He was a super humble dude, really nice guy, and one of my favorite moments as a gamer of meeting people like that. I just thought that was a cool story to share, that I got to meet him. So, because it turned out like his studio is based in Bethesda, Maryland, which wasn't far from there, So
right, exactly.
So yeah, that was really cool.
Yeah, man, there's so much good stuff nowadays. What are some of the games that you're enjoying now, or you're looking forward to coming out?
Excuse me. Well, it's funny, with modern gaming, there's a lot of things that can be said about modern gaming, both good and bad. But for all the good and bad things you could say, there are definitely been some really top quality experiences that I've had in recent years on modern gaming consoles. Nintendo is still putting out tons of high quality games, like Super Mario Odyssey is phenomenal. I love Super Mario Maker 2. I have probably put like 20-25 hours into that game, or at least it feels like I've put 20-25 hours into that game in the last week, because I just can't put it down. Those are really great games. It's funny, I brought up the formative experience of Resident Evil 2, and we got an excellent top tier remake of that game this year from Capcom that I absolutely adored. So yeah, I've also been a pretty big fan over the years of fighting games, competitive fighting games, and I enjoy Street Fighter as much as the next guy. But my formative experiences over the years were with games like Tekken, Soul Calibur, and Mortal Kombat. I especially loved Mortal Kombat 2 and 3. Well, recently, there was Mortal Kombat 11 released by NetherRealm Studio, and me and a few of my friends here in Virginia have just been wearing that game out. Like, I think we get together at least once a week to do at least a first to 10, first to 10 matches, so to speak. And that game has been an absolute blast to play. I also, speaking of, we talked, it's funny how, like, with gaming, so much is kind of following the pattern of what's old is new again, retro type stuff. Yeah, we talked about RE2 and we talked about all the other stuff. Just a couple weeks ago, I actually picked up, Activision put out a remake or a remaster of Crash Team Racing, which was the Crash Bandicoot kart racer that came out back for the PS1 back in like 99 or so. And I wasn't really big on that game back then. It was just one that didn't really interest me all that much, because I had Mario Kart. I didn't need it. But I picked that up a couple weeks ago, and that game has also been very hard to put down. The remaster is really high quality, and it's very similar to how you have the top quality Crash and Spyro remaster trilogies that have been coming out in the last year or so. Very, very high quality stuff there. But I think another thing that I really love about, modern gaming is, we've kind of seen this flourish in the last few years of the independent game. And now that, companies like, PlayStation and Nintendo and Microsoft have these online storefronts that these companies can go out and say, you don't need to have, you no longer need the backing of a company like Activision or Ubisoft or Electronic Arts or even Sony, Nintendo, or Microsoft to put out a quality game anymore. You look at, obviously Kickstarter has had an influence on that with games like Shovel Knight, for better or worse, Mighty Number 9. A lot of people are not big fans of that game, admittedly. Yooka-Laylee, which is kind of a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, which also kind of got mixed reviews. I enjoyed that game. And recently, another game that I have really been enjoying recently was one that I backed on Kickstarter like 4 years ago. Koji Igarashi, who is the guy who was the director behind arguably the greatest Castlevania game ever made, which is Symphony of the Night, which was a PS1 game. Man, quick side note, man, the PS1 was a good console. God, it was so good. That was another heyday for RPGs, but anyway, I digress. But he doesn't work for Konami anymore, but he wanted to make a new game in that same vein because he was in charge of basically every major Castlevania game they released for the better part of the last 10, 15 years, or at least the one since Symphony of the Night. And so he and his company kickstarted a game called Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, which is clearly very much playing in that same vein as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. And, given some of the mixed results on Kickstarter, I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but it is a wonderful, wonderful game with a wonderful score, great music, so many different RPG mechanics and so many different weapons to use. And that game has been an absolute blast to play. As far as things that I'm looking forward to, it's funny I talk about formative experiences and remakes because you were there when we got our first look in about 4 years at the remake of Final Fantasy VII.
Yep. And
how hyped my wife and I are for that game because, again, I'm not going to sit here on this podcast because I know I've had a lot of people over the years when I start talking about how much I love Final Fantasy VII, I will inevitably get it's so overrated. It's really not that great. 10 is so much better. 9 so much better. 6 is so much better. I'm like, okay, whoa. I get it. Like everybody's got their favorite, and I'm not besmirching anybody's favorite because like Jerry and I've had that conversation, and he's like, I like 7, but 6 will always be special to me. I will always love 6, and that's how I feel about 7. I'm not gonna sit here and say 7's the best Final Fantasy ever, but as far as Final Fantasy and in terms of its meaning to me personally, none of the other ones come even close. And that's not really any fault of them. It's just that 7 it just resonated so very much with me that I just loved everything about it. Like its music, its characters, its story, its world. It just hit so many of my check boxes that I just couldn't help but love it. And that's why I hold that game so highly. And to see it getting remade in such a glorious, beautiful way, it's like, it reminds me of when I saw the FMV cutscenes for 7 when I was a kid and how blown away I was by how good they looked. They don't hold a candle to what this game looks like. And that's the gameplay. And like, that is mind blowing to me. And the same thing with RE2, like the cutscenes in RE2 and the gameplay in RE2, we thought that looked phenomenal in 1997, but 1998, RE2 came out in 98. Sorry. But in 98, we thought that was gorgeous. Compared to the Resident Evil 2 that came out for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC this year, it's not even close. It's like, was this made by the same company even? Like, the contrast is so different and it's so amazing. And like those Final Fantasy VII and RE2, those games, when you hold them up side by side to their original counterpart, you will see how far gaming as a medium has come. Both not only just in graphics, but in game design as well. Just like gaming has evolved so much, and it's so incredible. But one other thing I just want to add on the independent side of things is also thanks to the independent game scene, we've had games like Hollow Knight and Shantae Half Genie Hero and Dead Cells. Dead Cells is another one that I'm a big fan of. I haven't quite finished that one myself, but I really like that game a lot. It's a very tough game, but it's a very fun and a very addictive one. I don't know if have you played that one?
I haven't. I mean, again, I wonder about my timing as far as games go. I have a PlayStation 4, and I'd say 90% of the games that I own are still in shrink wrap. I have an account for PlayStation Plus, and I downloaded the new game, Detroit Become Human.
Yes,
was one of the free ones, and it'll probably sit there. I have Until Dawn. And I got that because my wife wanted to play it. So I got it so that way we could play it together. And we never have played it. And then, I'll play games on the PC, but it's hit or miss on, how much time am I going to sit here? Am I going to be able to save? Am I going to be able to enjoy myself? So it's more of a time management and getting time for my games.
Oh no. I absolutely get you on that. It's like, at the end of the day, you and I are both married men and we have full-time jobs. So, obviously the time we spend on these things is, something we have to budget basically.
Yep.
And, it's just, and also, I know you and I have had conversations even before this podcast about the styles of games that you enjoy. And they're the more slower paced tactical games like an XCOM or a Civilization or stuff like that. And that is, and that is 100% valid because those games, I know, as much as I know you've watched me play games like RE2 and Mario and been like, I don't know how you do it, Bryan, because it's so reactionary and Twitch based and all that. But at the same time, I'll watch you or Jazz Elves play XCOM 2, and I'm like, I would have been dead by turn 3. And it's like, because those like you can, but I say I doubt you'll disagree with the statement that XCOM 2 is hard.
Oh, there was, oh gosh, I was doing a Iron Man challenge on normal, mind you, normal, but Iron Man. So every turn you take, it auto saves, so you can't go back. You can't just say I'm save scumming. I'm going back. Nothing. I lost 15 people in the span of 3 missions, and I was like, "Yep, I'm done. I'm done." Like I made a misfortunate step, and I wiped a party, and I was like, "Okay, I'm going to take a break," because XCOM 2 does get a little I hate to say vengeful, or the computer comes after you and you're like, I'm standing right here, and where's my 80? I got 85%. I'm not hitting nearly enough as I should be. Like,
Yeah.
Come on, you're being cheap sometimes.
It's like when I was a kid, and I can remember one of my first D&D role playing experiences. I quickly got a reputation for being the kid with the worst luck on the D20 die rolls. It got to a point that my friend who was DMing the game said, "Okay, so Bryan, I need you to listen real carefully to me. This is a gelatinous cube. It has an armor class of 2. The only way you can miss is if you roll a 1. Guess what I rolled? Ta-da!
Ta-da!
And my character got stuck in the gelatinous cube because he apparently can't do anything right. But, I feel like that's the equivalent of XCOM missing at 85%. It's like, come on, dog. Really? Like, it's like, you're killing me, Smalls. You're killing me. Oh. Literally, I'm dying. My character is dying because you're doing that.
Yep. So, we'll switch over, Video games are a good segue, and I talked about it at the beginning when we started. Is that I found you through a mutual Twitch streamer, Jazz Elves, and you are a Twitch streamer. How did you get into Twitch streaming, and more importantly, I guess, is why did you get into Twitch streaming? Why did you decide to do it?
Well, for me personally, it was a case of like, gaming, it really just stems back from my passion for gaming and how much I loved it. And more importantly, how much I love talking about it. And I mean, hell, you and I've talked about it for a solid hour now. So there you go right there. And any chance I would get to talk with people about games and share our love of games, was something that I relished. And getting and not to mention, not to humble brag or anything, but I'm not a bad gamer. I'm a decent video game player. So I was like, hey, I'm knowledgeable. I'm nice. I better say I like talking with friends. I love to talk about games. I love to talk about friends. I talk about games with friends. What better way to do it than share my gameplay on Twitch? And and especially after my friend, one of my college buddies, got into watching things on Twitch. And he told me about this guy named Tim the Tap Man, who is now a very, very prolific streamer. He got big doing stuff like Counter-Strike Counter-Strike Global Offensive and stuff like that, and and Fortnite and stuff like that. And I started watching him, and I'm like, wow, this guy's pretty entertaining, and I'm not trying. I would never claim to be a guy who's going to try to outdo a guy like that, because I know that's not going to be me, But I'm like, hey, you know what? I'll put myself out there. I'll do some stuff with games, and not only that, but when I decided I wanted to make Twitch streaming a regular thing, I did. I had just made a very good close friend at that time. My friend named Chris, who is still a very, very, very good friend of mine, and I reached out to him because one thing that I found that I had struggled, because I had done a couple little individual streams by myself, but one thing I found I was kind of struggling with was there would be times when I really didn't know what to talk about. And that's one of the things that's really hard when you're streaming, especially by yourself, is, you don't ever want to go, you try not to go quiet, because you don't want to just be a face staring at a screen on their stream. But sometimes you're like, I don't know what to talk about, So I reached out to my friend Chris and I said, hey man, I kind of want to start doing a regular stream, and I think it'd be really cool if you would join me for it. And he was 100% down for it. He was just like, yeah, I would love to do that. And so we sat down and we talked about it. We planned out a schedule, and we started talking about, what would we want to call it. And we were batting a number of names back and forth. And I came up with the name Professionally Unprofessional Gaming, which had a ring to it, but it was also like a 40 character name, and I realized real quick that when I tried to go into other people's streams with that name, the streamer, I would know the streamer had noticed me when I would see them squint at the screen. They're like, oh, hi, bro, what is your name? It's just kind of like, that was kind of the moment of like, okay, I kind of need to dial this back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Thankfully, around that time, Twitch gave us the option to kind of modify our name a little bit. And so what started as Professionally Unprofessional Gaming became ProUnproGaming, as it is today. And, he and I started, doing regular streams, basically playing whatever we felt like, usually whatever new thing came along. We got in, I think the first thing we ever streamed was when they put out the remake of the original Resident Evil on PlayStation 4. That was the first game I ever played on stream. And I originally set it to the default controls, to the analog control scheme that they added in the PS4 port, because I thought he might want to take turns playing. But eventually he was like, you know what? I'm just going to watch you. So we were yucking it up as I played Resident Evil, and then we played a bunch of other stuff. Drew some good numbers playing this game called Scream Ride, which was this constructing roller coaster game that Microsoft put out for the Xbox back then. And we had a lot of fun with that. And just over time, but we were still kind of new to the whole Twitch thing and understanding what it meant to really build an audience and get your name out there and stuff. And I want to say about a year to 2 years ago, Chris started getting really busy. And he was having to miss more and more streams because he had become the manager at the restaurant he worked at. In fact, he now manages that restaurant. Was a local restaurant, and it's now branched out to 2 and soon to be 3 restaurants. And I think he manages the one that's close to me. And he was like, "Hey man, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to miss another stream." And I was finally like, "Hey man, just checking in. I know you're really busy, and this wasn't me being nasty at him. This was just me being, hey man, I understand you're really, really busy now. I understand you've got, by this point, he had a fiance, or at the very least, a girlfriend that he was very serious, who would eventually become his fiance. And he had a lot of work stuff to take care of and a lot of other stuff. And I'm just like, hey, man, do you want to just kind of take a step back and let me kind of run the ship for a while? And I told him, I'm like, hey, anytime you want to come back, you are always going to be welcome here. But if you want me to just kind of say, hey, you're not obligated to be a part of this, you can let me run the ship now. Because by that point, I'd kind of gotten to a point that I felt like I could run it by myself. And I was not having as much trouble talking to my audience by myself as I was when I started. And he was like, oh, I really appreciate you saying that, because he was like, I didn't want to ask because I didn't want to make it sound like I was kind of, abandoning you or anything. But I'm like, and I told him, just like you told me, hey, man, we're adults. We have lives to live. I understand that. I also understand that it's not a small thing for you to drive all the way from your town to my town, even once a week to do that. So that was kind of how it became my thing. And, thanks. And it's, the funny thing is I've definitely had some nights where, it was lower attendance, and I won't lie and say that those nights weren't a little disappointing, because it can be kind of, disheartening to stream to nobody, but, eventually, I kind of hit the point of, okay, well, you know what? I wanted to play the video game anyway. If people come to watch, cool. If they don't, that's okay too. But, then I started, going to other people's streams, and then Jazz Elves started coming to my streams. And Jazz Elves and I had been friends going back to, I want to say, I think we had been friends since I was a freshman in college in 2003.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, like I knew him long distance. Like, funny enough, I actually met Jazz Elves in World of Warcraft. I was actually in his World of Warcraft guild. And funny enough, that's also how I met Ikoma Tanamori, as you know him as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to be really good friends with them. And we just became super close friends over that. And then Jazz started, streaming, and he started doing really well for himself, as you've seen. And, he and I started talking about it, and he was like, and I was just like, wow, you're pulling in some really good numbers. And I was like, I'm not sure what I'm doing. I was kind of having a thing like, I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. I feel like I'm being, approachable in my streams and, doing good things. And he was like, well, the thing is, the one thing he said is, Bryan, I've had a lot more free time recently. So I've had time to go to other people's streams and, talk to people and network with them and do that. And I was just like, that was a really transformative conversation for me as a streamer, because, up to that point, I'd kind of had this mistaken mentality of, having friends in your stream was something you did just so you weren't streaming at zero numbers, so people wouldn't just completely skip over you and go, oh, there's nobody watching him. What's the point? It was something to have your numbers up so that it would make people go, oh, he's got people watching him. I should go watch him. And it was just a matter of getting discovered. And over the course of my conversations with him on his philosophy on streaming was really transformative for me, because I realized, wait a minute, it's not about, the secret isn't having friends in your chat so that it attracts more people. The secret is making more friends.
Yep.
So, after that, I started hanging out in a lot of different streamers, audiences, and getting to make some really good friends on Twitch. Folks like Sir Caitlin, obviously our friend Mama Dubs. I've been in a few of her streams. She's super nice. Wonderful, wonderful lady. Let's see, Mrs. E, New Al Hudis, Duty Beard, and all these people that I would never have known about if I hadn't talked to folks like Jazz Elves and stuff like that. And I started, and then the more I did that, the more people that knew me. And then suddenly those people were coming to see me. And, it was, and like, that was like an epiphany for me as a streamer. Like, this is what my focus should be. My focus should be is, I like, real talk, at this point in my life, I could probably count on one hand the amount of shows I've watched, the amount of times I've watched traditional television. I spend a lot of my time watching Twitch streams now, not just because it's important for me as a streamer to network and know these people, but just because like it's a lot more it's a lot more enjoyable for me to share those experiences with those people. A lot of people, like I remember a friend of mine watched a Twitch stream once and he didn't get it. Like he was like, well, I don't see what the appeal is. And he actually wasn't super happy because this person was like getting donations from people and like getting all this money. And he got kind of angry about it because he was just like, wait a minute. So this guy can sit at home and play video games and make like thousands of dollars a day, and I go work an 8-hour job and I don't make crap. It's like, and and I could see why some people might see that, and it's like, because to somebody who looks at something like that, they probably think, what's the big deal? It's like he's just sitting there playing video games, but it's so much more than that. It's, there's a reason why if I'm having a rough day and I'm not all there mentally, I will sometimes cancel a stream because, it's not a matter of me just sitting in front of my monitor playing, Resident Evil 2. I've got to talk and be engaging with an audience. I'm effectively my own little TV series,
Yep.
And that takes a lot of emotional and mental energy to do that. So I have all the respect in the world for people, like a Tim the Tatman or a Ninja or a Dr. Disrespect, whoever you follow, these people that stream to 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,000 people at a time. I can't even fathom that. And to be honest, like to a certain extent, I'm not even sure I want that. Cause like, I'm sure there'd be people who would hear me say, oh, you're just saying that, but it's like, no, but like honestly, like the days when I have like, 10 to 20 people, like that's incredible for me. Like I love those days, but like, it's hard for me to imagine, having 70, 80, 90, 100, 200, 300 people and watching the chat fly by and not seeing half the things people say. Like,
Yep.
I don't know how those people do it. It's really remarkable to me. So, again, I have nothing but respect for people that manage to do that, because that I can't imagine doing that. Admittedly, I think it's just a matter of at that point, they just, they try to engage the chat as much as they can. But at that point, they've built so much of a following that, people are just there to see them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's crazy because like, and I've told my wife this on occasion about Twitch, is that there are times where I'm looking for people that are just playing the game. I want to see if I'd be interested in the game. And like you and Jazz, and then there's a few others that I follow, you guys play the games where I'm really interested in the games, but I've realized real quickly after watching the stream for a little bit, it's not a game I can play, but I'm going to have a heck of a time watching you play that game and be along for the ride, so that way I can, be involved in that game and that gameplay experience. It's as if, we're having a sleepover essentially back in our younger years. I'd be watching somebody play the game and I'd be there to like assist or, cheer them on, and it'd be that shared experience. It's just now it's on the internet.
That's a really great way to put it. I really like that, because I've kind of had a similar thought myself. Is like, it reminds me of like when you and your friend are huddled around the television trying to beat like Ninja Gaiden on the NES or something like that. And you're just like, or you'll be like, oh, you missed an item back there, or there was a shiny thing over there. You should go get that or go explore that. And yeah, of course, backseat gaming, there should be some limitations there as well, of course. But like, I still think one of the coolest experiences I ever had, and it was in a losing effort, was I remember when I was streaming the RE2 remake, and I was playing through that mode called the Fourth Survivor, which was the hunk scenario. And I was and like, it was so funny because the whole time, you'll remember my wife Joy, Mrs. Pug, as she has become affectionately known on the stream, is sitting there squealing and yelping around every corner as like the zombie lurches out, or the tyrant shows up, or a dog comes and tries to chomp on my neck meats, and I think I got like to right at the end of the scenario, and I ran out of ammo and I ran out of grenades, and I got grabbed, and it's like, no, I was so close. But it was so much fun because everybody was invested in it. And I just remember you messaging me after I died and was like, Bryan, I had a panic attack watching that.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there have been times where it's like, oh gosh, my heart rate just watching you. Even recently, which by the time this episode comes out, it'll be like a month ago, but Super Mario Maker 2, and you're trying to beat that level in like 30 something seconds, and it's like so close, like microseconds.
Yeah, it was like, it was literally like you had to like, you needed every moment of that 40 seconds to beat the level. And I even remember having like a friend of mine in that chat going, how in the blankety do you do that? Like, he's just and when he says that, he's not even talking about me. He's talking about like when I came that close and still died and ran out of time. He was just like, how how in God's name do you beat that? And I'm just like, wait a minute, I thought of one more thing. And then the very next level, I beat it. And he's just like, holy crap. And it's like, yeah, it's like moments like that are just really something that makes streaming really magical for me, I think. I was actually talking to Mrs. Pug the other day because I said, one fear I have playing that game, or any game for that matter, is that one of the things that kind of makes my anxiety go up is when I get stuck. And like I die like over and over and over on one part that's just really hard, because in the back of my mind, my brain's going, oh, people are going to get bored, and it's like, I know, but I can't beat it. But like at the same time, the gamer in me doesn't want to go to a strategy guide because it's like, no, I can figure this out. I don't need that. That's the competitive side of me that doesn't want to look it up, because no, I can figure this out. I know I can. I just need the time to do it. So I've kind of been having to strike that balance where, I used to kind of keep my emotions a little more in check playing games like Mario Maker or Resident Evil. But at the same time, I think people appreciate when I kind of emote and, drop an F-bomb and it's like, God, and I'm like so close to beating the level, but I miss a jump or mistime this thing or that thing. And then it costs me the run. And it's just like, no. And it's just like, I think I've come to realize that people appreciate that because it's relatable, and people, my emotions do not turn them off. If anything, it shows my investment in the game and entertaining that audience. So, but yeah, and speaking of fulfilling, actually, before I move on to the next point regarding my stream, I wanted to ask if you had anything you wanted to add to that point.
I was just curious how you choose your games that you're going to stream.
Well, I mean, I'll be perfectly honest, and this may not be the most exciting answer in the world, but it basically boils down to I pick games that I enjoy, I really don't, I will say that there is some consideration given to, is this a game that there's already 5 million people playing? Like, for example, I have on occasion streamed Overwatch, the Blizzard shooter, and I love that game. I adore that game. But at any given day on Twitch, there's probably 300,000 to 500,000 people streaming it. And needless to say, that's a crowded market, not to mention, like, normally people are more interested in seeing like really high level play at that game. And a high level Overwatch player, Papa Pug, is not. I love the game and I'm decent at it, but I ain't no pro. You ain't going to see me in the Overwatch League anytime soon. That's for damn sure. But I do love that game. But really, at the end of the day, like, I play games that I enjoy, that I can be passionate about, that I can, that I can talk to my stream about and share my perspective on and things like that. Like Mortal Kombat was a big one for me. Resident Evil is a big one for me. Mario is a big one for me. But really, at the end of the day, like, I am a firm believer that there's no point in playing games that are popular just to get attention, because, if you don't enjoy the game, it's going to show, I obviously another one of the big games that is popular on Twitch and in general these days is Fortnite, the battle royale game that Epic makes. And full disclosure, I downloaded it and I played a few rounds of it, and my ultimate takeaway is I definitely see and appreciate why so many people love this. It has a really cool art style. It's a really satisfying and fun game. It's just not for me. Like,
right.
It just did not resonate for me. And I'm just like, you know what? That's okay. Because not every game has to be for every person. So it was just a case of, so really at the end of the day, I tend to play games that I think, that I'll enjoy and that I feel comfortable sharing with people. Like, I probably would not, like, and that's proven to be games that I didn't even think would be big on Twitch for me. Like, I think you and I met each other after I finished my run of that series. But one franchise that proved to be very, 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 very hyped for my stream was the Danganronpa franchise. And that's actually a series of visual novel games that are all based around this like murder reality show, this reality game, basically. And it's very emotional and very intense. And there's a lot of like, Phoenix Wright style adventure type games and stuff like that. And like everybody was just completely drawn into the story of those games, and they were there in droves every week I played it, and just they were there for my intense reactions to the story and all the twists and turns. Just it was just, everybody was, as a community, were invested in that story, and that was one of the coolest things I've ever experienced as a streamer, was playing those games and having everybody kind of be along for that ride with me. And that really comes back to what I was talking about when I said I wanted to share my gaming experiences with people, and people that I care about. And that my playthrough of those games right there, that says everything about that. So one other thing that's really interesting for me as a streamer was, so my wife, Mrs. Pug, aka Joy, yeah. So my wife is a very introverted person. Basically, like, if she knows you and she's comfortable around you, she can hold a conversation for as long as you want to. But if she doesn't know you and she's not comfortable with you, she's very quiet, very non-talkative. And in general, she's not really big about, public speaking or being in front of a lot of people or anything like that. So you can imagine my surprise when about a year ago, she came up to me and said, "Hey, could I be a part of your stream?" I was just like, "Are you feeling okay?" Like, I mean, obviously I'm thrilled, and of course you can, but are you sure? Like, and she explained to me that, she's like, "Well, my thought of that is, I'm not really big on being around a lot of people in person, but I feel like being in a room with a bunch of people in a chat room wouldn't be as stressful for me." And I'm like, you know what? That makes sense. Okay, we'll do it. So, like, I pulled her in for a couple streams, and it got to the point where every Friday night, unless she wasn't feeling it, in which case I would stream solo, we would call Friday night my date night stream, where Mrs. Pug and I would play a cooperative game together, or in some cases, I would watch her play Stardew Valley and commentate with her on it. And I really think that's been a really cool experience, because, one thing that, that definitely was a topic of conversation for she and I was striking a balance between stream life, work life, and married life. And I mean, as we've already said, you and I are both married men. When you're a married man with a full-time job, there's a lot of demands on your time, even more so when you're a father like you are. And that's a demand I don't have on my time. But even just balancing my 8 to 9 hour a day job with my streaming, with my, need to, be a good husband to my wife, that there's a lot of demands on your time. And, so a lot of times, my wife and I would have, not long after we got married, I had conversations with my wife, like, so currently I'm streaming on this day, and that day. Is that okay? Or do you need me to kind of move my schedule around so that, you and I have more time together? Because, communication, as you know, is a vital thing in marriage. So,
yes, indeed.
Streaming or otherwise, regardless of whether or not streaming is involved. So we've had a lot of good conversations about, hey, do you feel like I'm giving you enough time, or do you need me to dial the streaming back? And pretty much every time I asked that, she was like, "No, you're doing fine." Honestly, she was more concerned. Like, she was like, "But do you have enough time for yourself?" And I'm like, honestly, I'm starting to feel like I don't. So that was kind of why I made the recent shift in my schedule, where I moved one of my days to the weekend, so that I had kind of more time during the week to take care of, regular life stuff, like, errands, bills, laundry, all that good stuff, household stuff.
Right.
So, and so really, I think she's really been, like, her involvement in the stream has been a great thing for a number of reasons. One is it's another thing that I get to do with her, which I love to do. We both love video games very much, so it's awesome when we get to play them together. So it's good quality time for us. I can tell you that the chat absolutely adores her. They absolutely love that woman to death. So it's really cool for me when my audience loves her as much as I do. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's really cool. I think that's really cool. And, on a personal note, I've been, she's also really been a good influence on, me during streams and the content of the streams, because you may recall, a couple months ago, we did our first ever mental health charity stream that we did for the Jed Foundation. That was entirely her idea, because we had already been doing the Extra Life charity stream every year in November. And she was like, well, mental health is really important to both of us. Why don't we do another charity stream, like, in the middle of the year for that? And I'm like, that is a wonderful idea, because there's so many more games nowadays that are confronting topics about that, mental health in general is a very important topic these days, as it should be. And so I think that, with her, pushing that idea and us working it together and, working on the games that we felt made sense for that kind of stream, we put together some really, really good content that, did some good work for that charity. And, I've been very upfront on those streams about my own battles with mental health stuff. Namely, in the last year or so, I've been diagnosed with anxiety, depression, and even ADHD, which my doctors growing up never picked up on that, but it's a testament to how much more medical science knows about those things than they used to. Because they used to think it wasn't that common, or at least I feel like they used to not think that, but now like they've realized that, wow, there's a lot of people who have depression and anxiety and disorders and things like that. We really need to start taking these things more seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been times on stream where like a hardware failure or me getting stuck in a game would start messing with my anxiety, and her being there to kind of talk me down and go, no, you're fine. It's nobody's upset by that. Just keep going. You're good. Like having that voice of reason when you're having those moments is a world of difference. Like I wish she had been there from day one. Like to have that around me would be just so remarkable. But yeah, so like her being a part of that stream, like I never want to go back to doing streams without her. At least, I mean, obviously, like I said, some nights she doesn't feel up to it, but I'm so grateful both to have her in my life, obviously, and for her to be a part of that together, because I think she makes the stream better, and naturally she makes me better too.
That is awesome to hear, especially having a partner to even if it's just sitting and hanging out watching you and being there, like it's just great.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and just and that's another thing that always makes me feel good is having her not only tolerate my hobbies but support them. And be like, I think you're doing something really special here. Not only do I support you doing it, but I want to be a part of it. I want to help you do it. And that has just been such a remarkable thing for our marriage, our relationship, and this stream. And just it's only made everything better and more satisfying to do it.
So what's going to be coming up for you in the future stream-wise for the rest of the year, so to speak?
Well, for the rest of the year, I'm currently still working through Ill Bleed on the Dreamcast. I'm about halfway through that. I definitely foresee a lot more of the Super Mario Maker streams coming up, because those have been doing very, very well for me, and everybody's been really hyped watching me play those difficult levels and finally achieving them, and that felt really awesome, and I want to do more of that. And it's actually really cool because people who had never been to my stream would show me like, hey, here's my level, could you play it on your stream? And I think that's cool that I get an avenue to share other people's levels on my stream. And it gives me more content to play that I might not have known about otherwise. So I definitely think there's going to be a lot more of that coming up. I know that in about 2 weeks from now, a Switch game that Mrs. Pug and I have been very, very anxiously looking forward to on this called Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, which is basically like a hack and slash Marvel RPG.
Yes.
And we actually had a chance to demo it at a Best Buy E3 event just a few weeks ago, and both came away very, very impressed. All of us came away very, very impressed with it. So I think what is going to end up happening is I believe that game, if I remember correctly, comes out on the 19th of July. So I believe our plan is obviously we'll be announcing like the exact times and stuff on our stream and on our Twitter as well at ProUnproGaming. But we're thinking that's probably going to be on one of our marathon type streams. Not like a big 12, 24-hour thing, but whenever a game comes out that she and I are really hyped for, like we did for Resident Evil 2 and Devil May Cry 5, we're probably looking at a good 5 to 6 hour stream of Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3. So that's definitely something I'm really looking forward to. And really more than anything, what I'm looking forward to in the rest of the year and the rest of, my life doing this is just, discovering more awesome games and more awesome people.
Well, there we go. Well, Bryan, I want to say, number one, thank you for being so generous with your time, because obviously if people are checking their timestamps, this podcast episode has gone much longer than a normal one, but I credit all of it to Bryan for being so willing with his time for talking about like everything that we've been talking about. So thank you for letting us go this long.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. I hope I didn't talk your ear off that entire time.
No, this is how I love to do podcasts, and when people get into it, and as long as they've got the time willing, I'm willing to do it. So I'm all good. But for those that have listened, what are the best places to find you on the internet?
Well, to all of you lovely people listening to Tales from the Fandom, you can find me on Twitch at twitch.tv/ProUnproGaming. That's ProUnproGaming. ProUnproGaming. I often refer to as Pug for short, PUG. You'll recognize me by the Pug logos all over the stream page. You can also find us on Twitter at ProUnproGaming on Twitter. That's where you'll also be able to find all that good stuff. Where you'll also find all of the machinations of the Pug mind as far as video games and whatever ridiculousness I'm thinking about that day. Lots of good memes there to be shared too, of course. And of course, that's also where I'll announce all of my upcoming streams and events and things like that. I also do have a Discord. If you're interested in joining that as well, Dave, I will provide you a link to share with the folks who maybe in the feed, in the info of the podcast, if they're interested. I can give you that as well, and that's where you can hang out with us on Discord. One other thing I do want to say is I stream Wednesday and Friday night from 8 to 11 p.m. and Sunday afternoons from 1 to 4 p.m. These are all Eastern Standard Times. And I really appreciate you having me on your show today. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation, and I look forward to seeing some of you guys out there in podcast land on my streams.
All right, so I'll have all those links in the show notes on the Facebook page and on the website, and definitely give Pug Bryan a follow. Most notably, go definitely check out a stream on his Twitch channel, because you'll have a lot of fun. The chat is incredible, and there's a lot of good people there hanging out, watching Bryan play through some games. And if you check out one of the Super Mario Maker streams, definitely have something to squish, because sometimes it's just I don't know how he gets through the levels, but he does.
It's stressful for me too sometimes, I promise.
I don't know how you don't throw controllers, but they're also expensive nowadays.
Yeah. Oh God, dude. Like I just recently bought another Switch Pro controller, because I have another one around. I just don't know what I did with it, and those things are $70. So you will never see me throw that thing.
Yeah. But Bryan, again, thank you so much for the time tonight. Everyone needs to go check out the channel and then chat some wrestling too.
Oh, please do. And just before we sign off, I just want to give some shout outs to some of my other favorite people on Twitch. Jazz Elves. By the time this podcast comes out, you guys have already heard the podcast from Cardia Plays. Cardia Plays is a wonderful, wonderful woman. Also a very good streamer. Sir Caitlin, Mrs. E, Carolina Blue Jay, all those wonderful people. New Al Hudis, Duty Beard. All these great streamers that, have continued to influence me with how positive they are with their communities and make me want to be better. And you know what, Dave? Thank you too, because you are always a privilege to have in my chat, and a wonderful person, and I'm honored to have been a part of this show. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/talesfromthefandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.